This podcast is sponsored by developmentaid.org, your gateway to international tenders, grants, and the largest job database in the aid sector. Secure free registration and access funding opportunities, calls for partners, exclusive insights, and weekly news digest. Become a member today to achieve your sustainable development goals.
Hello everyone, welcome to Development Aid Dialogues. I'm your host, Hisham Alem. Today we are going to look at COP summits from a different angle, not just as a big diplomatic show, but as a test of whether climate politics, finance, and impact measurements can actually align. To help us understand what COP summits really changed and where it fell short, I'm joined by Paulo C. Miranda. Paulo is the chairman, co-founder of Deep Organization. He's the senior executive in impact management, ESG finance, and sustainable innovation. With more than 20 years experience working at the intersection of capital policy and ecosystem in the emerging markets like Brazil. His work focuses on making sure that climate and development commitments are translated into measurable impact, not just political statements. Paulo, welcome to Development Aid Dialogues, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Paulo, let's start with context. Many people see COP meetings as political spectacles. From your lens of impact management and ESG finance, why do summits like this matter?
I think it matters mostly because when we decide to put a lot of time and a lot of people around the issue of societal changes, events such as the one occurred here in Brazil for COP30 is more than just a political gathering. I feel that it's one of those rare moments when the whole globe pauses around one single issue and start asking questions about that. So collectively, we are looking into what kind of future we're willing to build and if what we are prepared to give up to get from where we are today to where we want it to be tomorrow. In my work, at least with impact management, ESG finance, capital allocation, and a whole host of other things that relates to impact, COPs matter a lot because the declarations that they produce may or may not shape the rules of the games. It may or may not create incentives and expectations that eventually flow into budgets, balance sheets, and investment mandates. And this is a very important point. When that happens, a COP stops being just a diplomacy exercise and becomes a society at its best, negotiating how to align capital with livable future. It's one of the most important missions that I think we have today, every time that we're going to discuss the environment and the global climate agenda.
But some critics see that there's COP summits is too much noise and less achievement or outcomes.
Yes, I guess you have different views about this noise, let's put it this way. But there are a lot of good noises and there is also noises that you don't want to pay much attention to it. To be honest, I don't think we have moved very far away from those balance sheets and cash flow statements that I referred to. But when I was in Belém, in conversation that I had with people from different backgrounds, different agendas and purpose, I see that we are still not very close to closing the gap between the climate text and the financial system. But I do believe this is a process that is evolving. We have made some progress in the language, and we have recognized the scale of the problem in a much broader sense in society, but the real challenges remain, and that is how to connect the commitments on paper with how companies plan, price, risk, and deploy capital. So in that sense, the noise may appear to a lot of people that is more dust than anything else, but I think there are concrete issues on the table that has evolved and that we can move forward. For me, the task is not only to address climate change. This is the huge umbrella that also includes biodiversity loss, the degradation of nature through new facilities and regulations that many countries and constituencies are ready or willing to be ready to take on. But it's also to confront some of the more structural causes of climate finance, that we see, because a lot of people, when we see this issue of noise, see also a big mess. And I think we need to understand that this process is a process. It's not a product in itself. We need to construct this from bottom up. So when we see this whole discussion about the climate finance mess, mispriced externalities, short-term incentives, and the political economic of fossil fuels are big issues. And big issues tend to be complicated, and you need to address them in very clear and paced manner. Where do we see concrete attempts today to link, for example, transition plans to sector pathways, specifically sectors and corporate strategies, to the long term of cost of capital? That's where we must see the positive outcomes, because eventually this will impact how investors make decisions. So I think in that sense, we should be more positive about it. But I still see that we have a long way to go, and this is a journey. It's not just a process with beginning and end. We need to take a more long-term view and be more hopeful that we will be able to come to positive outcomes in the future.
I totally agree that it is a long journey. Building on that, you have said that COP outcomes only matter when they shape real investment decisions. Did COP30 in Belém bring us closer to that, or does a gap still separate the climate text from the financial system?
The point that I try to make here is really the implication of this critical political and financial game that we have on the question of fossil fuels. And the answer, it is obviously not obvious. We still need to get more answers out of this when it comes to the fossil fuel politics, let's call it. When something as central as phasing out fossil fuels cannot be named explicitly in a conference like COP, that tells us a lot about the true limits of the agreement, and that worries me. But I'm trying to look at it with the glass of water half full and not half empty. The signals that should be treated as non-negotiable, fossil fuels, deforestation, the protection of vulnerable communities, and a whole host of other issues are still being treated as chips in a large game of climate diplomacy, and we cannot let that happen. We need to keep the pressure on these topics no matter what. In the coming years, I think the test will be whether we are prepared to deal with this in a much higher level of commitment and compromise, or whether it can be just translated into binding decisions that will not or will go into decisions about production, about investment, about land use, and a number of other things. At this point, my sense is that governments are not fully prepared to take on such bold steps, except perhaps for Colombia, that have come out of the halls during COP in Belém and take bold statements about fossil fuel politics. I would hope this will be a successful commitment, but we still have to wait for that.
On the political side, I have read a piece you wrote about COP30 where you called out the politics of not naming fossil fuels. Why is that omission such a critical signal from your point of view, and what does it reveal about the deal's limits?
I think the most important thing is for us to realize that not naming fossil fuels explicitly, it means that we still have a global perception, and more than that, a global politics around the fossil fuel economy that has not break tide with the past. And we need to do that. There are today enough evidence that we have the technology to do that. We have the resources to do that. We have policies and programs that have worked across, especially in the global south, about how to address sustainable energy in a much more effective and productive way. So we not naming that during COP, so official statement, it's a clear indication of how tied to the past we still are. And that's why I think it's a critical issue, is still to be addressed.
Turning to the finance track, we heard the $1 trillion investment figures and new financing mechanisms. From an impact finance view, how do you separate credible pathways from accounting optimism or creative storytelling?
When we talk about accounting optimism or even the storytelling that we hear about that, I think we need to be very realistic. And I learned that from someone who had the very important to me. I think we need to understand the genuine ambition and the kind of accounting optimism that we need to see that goes beyond just creative storytelling. It's something that requires a political will and a leadership, a quality of leadership that it's not an easy thing to achieve. When you work, as I have, in development programs, humanitarian aid and assistance programs, refugees and displaced people, you become very much sensitive when you see the gap between big financial pledges and what actually reaches the ground. This is something that a lot of people during COP won't understand unless if they have had first-hand experience in this field. So any global mechanism to mobilize such amount of capital in a relevant way is an exercise of tremendous political will, as I said before, not rhetoric. And I learned that from the privileged time that I had when I worked with former President Jimmy Carter through the Carter Center. And he showed us that the same risk exists when we put ourselves to talk about commitments into much greater causes of human needs and what actually we are able to achieve on the ground. So we need to change the underlying rules of the game for the kind of pledges we see today in the global climate agendas. And the urgency for this is so greater that I think it's as important as if we were dealing with such a humanitarian crisis that we see today around the globe. And to be more specific, in the case of impact finance for the climate urgency response, for example, just for the less privileged countries, we're talking about huge amounts of money, between $200 and $300 billion a year. How do you translate that into pledges, to commitment, to actually putting the money where it needs to be? It's a huge task. So I think we need to rethink about a lot of these issues. We need to rely on relabeling or repacking existing instruments in a way that they become actual tools and not just desirable tools in a toolbox. We need new rules of engagement that cross over traditional market regulations and economic pacts and that redistribute risk and reward in a much more honest way. And this is something we are not really seeing today. I don't think the purely political and diplomatic spheres on their own will make that shift at the pace of change that we need to experience today.
Paulo, you have said we need, we want. Define we, and who will satisfy the needs and wants that you are speaking about? Decision makers, politicians, NGOs, private sector.
Yes, I think it's important that we define we. I take we first on the personal level. So we, as you and I, and everyone that you and I knows around us who cares about these things and that we need to take action. So I am an entrepreneur, so I like to see the world around me with a bunch of entrepreneurs and investors that have helped my journey as an entrepreneur as part of this we. I also think we need to consider we and identify all of those civil society organizations that are seriously committed to this process as part of we. But we need to voice that and we need to be specific about that. And I don't like to say we in general terms. So when I say we, I also say we to investors or group of investors about their role and their level of accountability and responsibility in this process. But I see less of a we when we're really talking about government officials and policymakers, because that changes so much from time to time. And the proof of that is just what we have seen happen in the world over the last 5 to 6 years in terms of this we of political leadership that we experience today. For me, we has to have an address, if not just an IP address on a social network, a real address to whom we should address to.
Paulo, you also worked deeply on definitions. In your view, do COP outcomes strengthen efforts to clarify what counts as green or transition, or are they still too vague to guide investors and regulators?
Maybe we're halfway there. I think we are slowly moving away from things that are vague towards a more evidence-based understanding of what green and transition actually means. I think one of the advantages when we work with data, financial data and impact data, environmental data, is that you can start looking to this evidence-based with a little bit more of objective and positive perspective. So good taxonomies help us to see through this process. They do not solve everything, but they can give us, entrepreneurs, regulators, bankers, and investors a more consistent base of comparing such things as risks, costs, and opportunities. And they can also help us open the space for better design of green and transition regulations. And this is something we have experienced in some countries already. In Brazil, we see this in two ways or two layers. We have a very active green private sector here, if you will, and they have been doing good work in terms of sustainable finance frameworks through the leadership of the Brazilian Business Council for Sustainable Development. But another side of this coin is the ongoing effort here in our country to build a national green taxonomy that speaks to international standards and respect and recognize the local realities of what a sustainable society is in Brazil. So I think these two aspects help us move from purely sometimes vague notions or understandings about what green transition is and come to a more clear understanding. Nevertheless, I think I'm a bit cautiously optimistic about this because this is a process that needs to embrace and involve a larger number of countries and governments. And I think we don't have that process in motion. I'm not aware of how many countries have seriously adopted green taxonomies as a policy directive as part of a country's strategy to deal with environmental or climate issues. I know Brazil has, and I think few other countries have, but I think we need to align this on a much broader scale. And I think one problem with that is that for regulators, this seems to be not so clear at one point. For private sector and decision makers, it also takes time to make sure that they understand that. I think here in Brazil, there's a lot of active and positive advocacy to make the Brazilian green taxonomy a real strategic instrument, not only for policymakers, but for private sectors in general. And for me, from an entrepreneur's point of view, this can feel somewhat paradoxical because we tend to resist frameworks because we're driven by innovation always. But in the long run, I believe the approach adopted in Brazil will create more benefits than obstacles. And I'm hopeful that we will see positive effects of that very soon.
Let's talk about accountability. You often discuss the gap between climate politics and impact accounting pledges without solid links to results. Did COP30 narrow the gap or just repackaged all the problems?
I'm not sure whether COP30 helped to narrow the gap or mainly repackage old problems into new languages. And I think this is something that we have seen a wide range of views about it. For me, nevertheless, it's too early to tell how the announcements that we saw in Belém will translate into actual changes, especially when looking into capital allocation, regulation, and accountability. And accountability from all sides of the game, all sides of the process. But my sense from coming out of Belém is that the awareness of the gap has become much more explicit. And I think this is a positive side. Almost everyone with whom I talk about it recognize that this is no longer an issue of sustainable to have in just one conversation. We need to be able to introduce this in all kinds of negotiations, all kinds of issues related to the climate agenda. And I think we have to see from now on very different realities within corporate strategies, within organizations dedicated to promote social impact, and even as policymakers take that into public budgets. I think we will see for those countries that are really trying to push the agenda forward, and more so within those countries, the private sector and the civil societies that are really able to sit around table and discuss how do we move from one point to the next and to the next and to the next, a much more progressive agenda going on. But I think the message for me was clear. The gap is definitely not reduced. Climate risk, social vulnerability, and political fragmentation will continue to build up. But we have to stand firm and we have to work with that reality. And why I say that? Because I have been arguing in a much more specific settings when I have a chance to talk with people about it, that maybe we need to also start thinking about sustainable humanity. Maybe we need to start thinking about let's move COP from one stage to a next evolution stage. Maybe we should call COP a conference for sustainable humanity, a platform where climate development, inequality, financial stability are treated as part of the same question. Because at the end of the day, you leave COP, I left Belém with the sense that we are dealing with humanity's future and how we plan to address that. So I think in Belém, we have a sort of preamble to start thinking about that. An imperfect but important step. It was to recognize that our problem is not only emissions, greenhouse gases, our problems are much greater, but the architectures of our economies need to be addressed beyond just climate issues.
That leads me to an important question. From a development perspective, and given your experience in fragile and the crisis-affected settings, how will the COP address communities already living with volatility, displacement, and compounded risks?
I think what we experienced in Belém, it was important in terms of understanding the dimension of this global agenda, transcending beyond climate and environmental issues to humanitarian crisis issues, which climate and environment is part of. So if we're serious about the idea of dealing with the humanity's future in the context of this whole set of questions that were brought in by a number in a very broad spectrum of representatives we saw in Belém, the first step to stop treating nature, the environment, and climate impacts as side effects. Or even worse, make them as hostages in any kind of negotiation about anything else if it's not to look into humanity's future. In my work, at least in development finance and humanitarian programs, I have seen what volatility, displacement, compound risk really look like for people who are already living at the edge of situations that even inside the best settings of discussions at COP, people don't have idea about it. For these people, climate change is not an abstract of probability effects. It's part of their daily survival. That's why we need to move and raise our level of consciousness about COP being just a climate conference, an environmental global forum, to a level of humanitarian situations where the daily survival of people is not being affected just by droughts or excessive rain, but for the whole aspect of humanity as a whole. And one issue I have with that, to tell the truth, is that traditional asset owners and investors who ultimately control many of the big capital decisions that sometimes even emerge after events like this, I ask them to have a more deeper understanding of what it means to endure these types of impacts over time. Losing your home twice in a decade, rebuilding your livelihoods after repeated floods or droughts, living out of poverty, escaping from violence, living with a permanently uncertainty. It's not something that it's part of how asset owners, investors, even policymakers make decisions. We need to bring this whole host of actors and players to understand this reality. Sustainable living has to be recognized as a kind of asset in itself. I have been advocating for that for a long time. Sustainable living as an asset with real financial implications in terms of productivity, stability, and long-term value. If we don't internalize that, we will keep designing products that look innovative on paper, but fail where the risks are actually happening. As an entrepreneur, I always look into the impact of any innovation and how this innovation will make our lives not easier, but better.
For a man like you that you have spent years refining impact metrics that connect capital with results, what reforms or tools are most urgent to ensure climate finance is judged by outcomes, not just disbursement volumes?
I think when we look at what we read in the news about global funding, we understand that we still are in a situation that it is far below what is needed to make credible dent in emissions and adaptation gaps. We have situations that the reality of new facilities tools can help, but I'm not so convinced yet that they will help by themselves. We need to think beyond that. We need to think about changes that will actually create benefits or changes that will diminish the risk that these changes will carry. Because at the end of the day, if we do all this, if we design all these facilities and tools, if we allocate capital inside these facilities and tools, much will depend on the effects of how we prioritize projects. How do you translate projects into realities that people can incorporate the effects of the changes that we want to produce, especially when we look into local communities, and whether they mainly are going to be part of a de-risking of existing flows, especially flows of capitals from one sector to another, but does not change reality. This becomes a big problem, and I think becomes a vicious cycle. So you do something now thinking that it's going to be better, and you don't see the betterness having long-term effect. You just see the needed change. But in the end, what we really need to do is to make sure that any new facility and tools that we create have an effective and true impact in the global architecture that is dealing with climate change. Even with significant capital, it is not sufficient if we fail to address the many externalities and structural imbalances that are already widening this gap between vulnerabilities and climate action, especially considering the poor and the more exposed regions around the globe. This is almost a non-negotiable kind of situation. So in my view, I think we cannot wait for perfect designs. We need to move fast with pilot structures, pilot tools, pilot trials, test them, make them happen in real context, understand and learn from their failures, and only then start looking to more stable adaptation, to more scalable frameworks, and then we will be able to see the extent of the impact over such sophisticated level of financial commitment and decisions. But the worst outcome would be to add another layer of complexity without improving the distribution of benefits and responsibilities. And this we need to look collectively, not individually.
As an impact-driven executive, what worries you most? Greenwashing, stranded communities, or capital that doesn't move as promised?
It's a little bit of those. I'm very sensitive about stranded communities. I think when you accumulate the kind of experience I have accumulated working in development field and humanitarian assistance programs, and even to some extent impact investing, stranded communities, it's something that touches you deeply. It's important for us to understand that situation, because if you go to communities like that and people in situations of stress, lacking opportunity, or in risk of any other nature beyond just the climate risk, you have to ask yourself that question. Are these people in this situation because they want to be and they don't see a way out, but because they were forced to be in that kind of situation, or the decisions that were taking thousands of miles away from them that had an impact in their reality were not really sensitive enough to understand how these communities were being stranded. So if we link that to the flow of capital, then we'll see the dimension and the linkages between how, when you move capital from one place to another, how when you decide about an investment strategy or investment program that will have disbursements elsewhere, if you don't realize that the implications of that can change the realities of people, reality of the entire community, then I think we are doing a great disfavor to respond to more sustainable world and sustainable living. So I think investors, they have to stay close to the real action, sometimes you say, or the real projects. They have to go beyond understanding intuitively what an investment decision will be like. And the difference between money spent and transformation achieved, it's very great. I can tell you firsthand. Policymakers and politics, unfortunately, often don't see that. And that is a significant part of the gap that we still see today and that we need to close.
Paulo, since COP30 President Lula da Silva has asked his government to design a national roadmap to gradually reduce Brazil's dependence on fossil fuels, including an energy transition fund financed partially by oil and gas revenues. From your perspective, is using fossil fuels income to finance the transition a smart, pragmatic solution, or does it risk creating new contradictions in Brazil's climate policy?
I think this is one of those very critical questions that we have to address today after COP30 in Belém, as part of the commitments and actions that the Brazilian government is taking on. But I would start saying that it's a clever idea with a built-in contradiction in it. On the positive side, what I see is the logic is clear. We will use part of the rents from the old energy system to finance the new one, and that kind of makes sense for most of us. If it is well designed, an ETF funded by oil and gas revenues can send an important signal that we are willing to connect to the source of the problem directly to the financing of the solution. And I think that's a positive step. And I think we need to see this in the right direction. However, it can also be and become a trap. The more the government relies on future fossil fuel income to feed the fund, the stronger the incentive to keep expanding the fossil fuel frontier. And that's where I think the first dangers of this decision relies, or the cautionary note that we need to take when looking to this mechanism. In that scenario, the fund risks becoming a kind of moral license, if you will. We feel entitled to explore more as long as a fraction of the money is labeled transition. And if it's a fraction of the money is labeled transition and transition is not really occurring in the long term, we will feed the old economy, we will feed the energy system, we will provide more incentives to that, and a transition will be left behind the scenes. So for me, the real test is not only where the money comes from, but the rules around it. The rules that will determine how the fund will actually, in real terms, operate here in the country. If the fund is guided by clear transition criteria, anchor in a solid taxonomy, for example, the one that we have today, and measured by real changes in the energy mix and in people's lives, then I think we will have a valuable tool as a policy tool in the country to address the energy transition that we need. If not, it will remain closer to a political and accounting optimism rather than to a genuine impact. So in the general terms, that's how I see the fund strategy will unfold here in the country. We will need to pay close attention to it.
That is really helpful context, Paulo, especially on how you see the trade-offs in practice.
When we talk about such thing as transition, entire new systems of economy, we cannot be one or the other. we need to have a middle-of-the-road approach. We need to work on steps that are possible to reach the ultimate goal, to reach the ultimate commitment that we have, to step away from the fossil fuel economy. It's not an easy task, and it must be seen with a cautionary note in every aspect of a policy or a government decision. But if you look at the broad implications and the aspects related to that, we need to take this decision by the Brazilian government right now as a positive one, with the caveat that it could be a trap. It could unleash other forces that are more favorable in terms of continue with the exploration of a fossil fuel economy.
Thank you, Paulo. Let's move to another point. So if you could address three audiences, world leaders, financial institutions, and everyday citizens, what one message would you send each about what COP30 revealed and what demand next?
That's a bold request. I think I can address, at least try to address people close to me every day. But I feel much of what I would say to you, I would say to these audiences anyway. And I would try to say in a simple way. I think when we think of world and national leaders, my message would be that their responsibility is linked to the redesigning the rules of the game. And that means a lot. It means redesigning laws, fiscal regimes, trade agreements, public investment priorities, and even a country strategy to deal with sustainable humanity. And I'm not talking about this hypothetically, I'm talking about this in concrete ways, not only in short-term political cycles, but in long-term commitment. We cannot delay in see the higher costs and great instability and the level of climate, environment, and all kinds of injustice being perceived if we understand that we also have the capacity, resources, the science, the innovation at our hands. So we must use this in favor of humanity and not in favor of a political agenda specifically. I think to financial institutions and investors, my main message is for them to treat sustainable living as an asset class that underpins all other type of classes they are accustomed to deal with. The way you model risk, price capital, define your fiduciary obligations and duties will determine whether this transition is inclusive or orderly or whether it is chaotic and exclusionary. And I think it is their role to take this very serious. You cannot outsource that responsibility to future generations or even to policymakers alone. Oh, and finally, when we think about civil society organizations, I think we need to go back to that word, we. The accountability for impact is ours in the sense of we, for here and now. We cannot wait a new generation to try to take leadership on this. The responsibility is ours, and I think we need to make that very clear. I met a 10-year-old from Tanzania in Belém. Her name is Georgina, and she said that she was there to help us solve the environmental problems that she did not cause, and that's what she was there for.
Paulo, thank you for joining me and for bringing such a sharp, impact-driven lens to what COP summits did and didn't achieve. For our listeners, I hope this conversation helped you see why climate summits cannot be judged only by their final text or headline numbers, but by whether they reshape incentives, capital flows, and accountability in the real economy. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow Development Aid Dialogues on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe, share the episode, and stay tuned for more honest discussions with the people working at the front lines of global development and climate action. I'm Hisham Alam, signing off. Thank you for listening and see you next time. Goodbye.